My day job is in advertising and marketing, but my hobby since I was about 7 has been researching the Titanic, and I've discovered quite a few things about it.
What got you into studying the story of the Titanic?
So I first became interested in the Titanic and when I was about 7 years old. I watched a black and white film which some of your viewers and readers might recognise, called A Night to Remember. I highly recommend it, and I was only about 7 when I watched it, and I was probably a bit too young to watch it, but it just worked away in my mind. And then my uncle was taught maths by Lawrence Beasley, who was quite a well-known second-class survivor on Titanic, and so he had some books around the house about the Titanic, and that got me into reading first-hand accounts. And really, from reading first-hand accounts of people who were there, that was a great way to get into Titanic. And then as I got older, I realised there were 2 big inquiries into the Titanic, a British inquiry and an American inquiry. And then for my sins, I read all of the transcripts from those 2 inquiries, and really, a lot of postcards that were written, a lot of letters. So basically, I've kind of read all the first-hand accounts of people who were there or people who came to the rescue of that ship.
What happened to the Titanic on April 15th, 1912?
Well, Titanic was called practically unsinkable because, in a way, she was, because what they did is her designers worked out that she could float with any 2 watertight compartments flooded. So even if she had a crash on one of what we call the bulkheads, which is the walls that keep the ship watertight, she would still float. In fact, Titanic could have floated with all 4 of the forward watertight compartments completely full up. But her Achilles heel was she couldn't float with all 5. And unfortunately, the iceberg damage, a lot of underwater damage, actually breached into the 5th compartment. And that sealed Titanic's fate, because the pumps on Titanic were not sufficient to be able to take in, to get out that much water. So at that point, they knew Titanic was going to sink. They thought she'd sink in about an hour and a half. In fact, she lasted about 2 hours and 20 minutes before she sank. So Titanic really missed the iceberg, but unfortunately there was a large spur of ice under the water, and it did a lot of underwater damage, popping the rivet heads off of the plates, which allowed water in along a 200-foot of damage of Titanic's hull. And then what the ship did is it sank at the bow like that, and the stern did lift up, but after it got to about 15 degrees, and not that high, then the back broke. The keel was still there, and then as the heavy bow tried to kite down towards the seabed, it twisted against the stern and it tore off the keel. And then the stern bobbed for a little bit, with, very sadly, most of the passengers still on the stern that weren't in the lifeboats. And then eventually the stern sank a couple of minutes after the bow.
What really caused the Titanic to sink then?
I wanted to find out what caused the Titanic disaster. Now, don't get me wrong, all of your viewers know that it hit an iceberg and it sank, but I was looking at why did the best ship in the world, with the best crew in the world, paying attention, knowing there was ice in the area, what caught them out? Why did they ram into that berg on that night? And what's fascinating is that there were a number of reasons given at the time, or at least in the popular press at the time. So people said Captain Smith was drunk, so I investigated that. I found out he never drank at sea, so that was wrong. Then they said, well, the rudder wasn't big enough. And then I looked at the Olympic's rudder, which is her identical sister ship, and I found out that she was one of the best handling ships in the First World War. She is actually the only merchant ship to sink an enemy submarine. So I thought, well, it wasn't that. And then people said, oh, it's because they didn't have binoculars in the crow's nest. And I looked at that and I realised that binoculars are for inspecting an object you've already seen. They're not for identifying an object that you haven't yet seen. And the best way to identify an object like an iceberg at night is with the naked eye, because it has a wide field of vision. So if you think about it, I'm thinking, right, so it wasn't that Captain Smith was drunk, it wasn't that the rudder was too small, it wasn't about the binoculars, it wasn't that the rivets weren't strong enough, it wasn't the fire that caused such damage that it then sank. So I was left with, well, what did cause it? If it wasn't these things, what did cause it? And looking at all the testimony, I was trying to work out, where are we getting clues about this? And the main clue of that night is that a lot of the officers and many of the passengers said it was the clearest night in history. But all of the lookouts, and 6 of them survived, all of the lookouts said there was a haze around the horizon. So I got to thinking, who's right? Was it the clearest night in history, or was there a haze? And this led me to the discovery that there was a haze And it was one of the clearest nights in history, because there is a thing called a miraging haze, which you get, which looks like a haze, but it's not caused by water droplets like a normal haze. It's caused by the amount of air you can see through on a really, really clear night. So if they could see like 80 miles, when normally you could only see 20, they would get this haze effect, which was really light scattering in the molecules, in the depth of air that they could see through. And that's what got me onto maybe this haze on the horizon made them see the iceberg a little bit too late.
How did this affect the crew's decision?
Maybe it's 53 seconds or something like that, but they didn't have very much time from when they saw the berg to taking immediate evasive action, which they did take. But what's interesting is this slight haze was the same colour as the berg. So the berg is much nearer, the haze is way on the horizon, but the colour of the haze and the colour of the berg are basically the same. And the effect this had, and this is slightly complicated, but it reduced the apparent angular size of the berg. So for example, if you've got a berg this big, but because of the haze over half of it, it appears this big, then if only half of it is apparent to you than the whole of it, you're going to see that twice as late as you would normally see it. So it's going to be twice as near when you see it as normal. So in other words, the berg was still the same size, obviously, but because half of it was, shall I say that the contrast was reduced with the mirage behind, it meant that they only saw it at the same time that they would have seen a berg of half the size.
Did a fire on the Titanic make things worse?
The fire on Titanic is a very interesting story. There was a coal strike in 1912, and coal was brought from other ships and put into Titanic. And when you have coal in bunkers, ships move a bit, and it's called panting. And as they move, they can create heat in the coal. And actually, coal fires on ships are not that unusual. But coal fires are so hot that if you pour water in the top, the fire evaporates the water and you can't get the fire out. So it's no good. But they did play hoses on the fire, but in order to finish and extinguish the fire, they had to finish the coal. So they were raking out the hot coal that was burning. They were raking it out and throwing it into the boilers in order to put the fire out. And it took them until the day before the collision to put the fire out. So the fire was raging for 4 days on Titanic's maiden voyage. And it did damage the bulkhead, but the damage was sufficient to make it leak, or weep as we call it, about 1 bucket an hour. So the damage from the fire caused 1 bucket an hour of water to be leaked in from Titanic. But what you have to realize is, when the disaster happened, there was about a ton of water every second coming into Titanic. And so what you have to understand is that was totally insignificant. The other thing is, as the bow got lower and lower on Titanic, many passengers had opened their portholes to see why the ship had come to a stop, and they never closed them when they went up to the deck, and they left the portholes open. So with every porthole that went underwater, it doubled the size of damage to Titanic, because although the iceberg damage was over a 200-foot gap, it was only 3 feet by 4 feet. If you take it as a square, it wasn't only that big. So every 2 portholes that went under the water doubled the sinking speed of Titanic.
Has anything been overlooked in Titanic's story?
I think one of the points is, why did they see the iceberg too late? And this idea that water temperature in the area created very difficult conditions of visibility despite the clarity. I think that's a main thing that's been overlooked. However, for me, the part of the whole tragedy that is the most fascinating is that many people don't realise that as Titanic sank, only 10 miles away, apparently, was a ship called the Californian. And a lot of people on Titanic took calm and comfort from the fact that this nearby ship must surely be coming to their aid. But unfortunately, because of the atmospheric conditions that night, the nearby rescue ship thought, instead of thinking that the Titanic was the Titanic 800 feet long and 10 miles away, because of the raised horizon behind the ship, which is caused by the very cold air near the sea and light bending differently in that very cold air, they judged the Titanic to be only 5 miles away. And because they judged her to be only 5 miles away, they actually judged her to be a 400-foot ship. So they thought Titanic was a 400-foot ship 5 miles away, when she was really an 800-foot ship 10 miles away.
Are there any myths around the story that can be dispelled?
So, for example, the big one is that third class were locked below. Well, in fact, on that one, third class had to be separated by law from second class to stop the spread of infectious diseases, a bit like COVID precautions today. And in fact, you weren't allowed to open those gates between third class and second class unless there was a state of emergency. Now remember I said that in fact the Titanic didn't recognise that she was sinking until 47 minutes after the collision. So what happened was, as soon as they recognised that, 47 minutes after the collision, they opened those doors. They actually sent first class stewards down to help the third class up to the lifeboats. Sadly, third class people chose to stay on the ship, and that's because third class people had more children, bigger families than first and second class, many of whom were on business, travelling singly or in pairs, and therefore were more mobile. But in 1912, you were an adult if you were a male who was 13. You could work down the mine. And therefore, women and children first didn't include 14-year-old boys, for example. So any third-class mother and family who had, say, a son of 14 on the ship, they wouldn't want to leave them. So the third-class families, controversially, third-class families chose and elected to stay together on the ship. But of course, it was harder for them to have access to lifeboats because the lifeboats were in first class. But interestingly, the Board of Trade actually rewarded well-built, well-subdivided ships with the privilege of being able to carry less lifeboats, because what the Board of Trade did not want is unsafe ships that were leaky and that were likely to sink piled high with lifeboats. That's not going to help anyone. So what the Board of Trade wanted was really safe ships that won't sink, and then those ships only needed to carry enough lifeboats to ferry people from when the liner was stricken to a nearby ship. And that's why shipping lanes were invented. And the idea was you were never more than 60 miles away or a few minutes away from the next ship coming along. And therefore, lifeboats were designed to transship people in the event of a disaster, rather than to actually evacuate the entire crew and passengers.
What is the future for Titanic?
I think the future for Titanic should be to stop the decay now, and she'll be a lot worse in 10 years. She'll be a lot worse in 2 years. The quicker we can raise at least the bow of Titanic, the better. And we should put her in Belfast so that everyone can see her and she can be preserved and celebrated and fully understood. She could even go onto a barge and be, a huge barge I should say, and be a travelling exhibition where she could go to New York, she could go to Sydney, she could be one of the leading tourist attractions globally.